"We don't have room for you," my son said without meeting my eyes, like I was furniture too old to be moved again. The words landed heavier than the 2 bags I clutched in my aching hands. Rain tapped softly against the porch roof, polite in comparison. My shoes were soaked through, the hem of my coat heavy with dirty water. I blinked once slowly. Not because I was confused. No, I understood perfectly, but because I needed a second not to cry. Behind him, Claire stood like a statue at the edge of the hallway, arms folded, her lips pressed into that familiar, practiced neutrality. The hallway light flickered. Cheap bulbs or bad wiring, I didn't know. I hadn't been inside in months. I just thought, maybe for a few nights, I murmured. James sighed. "It's not a good time, Mom. The kids are stressed. Claire's been, it's just too much." Claire didn't correct him. Of course she didn't. I nodded. Small, silent. Not angry. God, not even surprised. "Right," I said. "I understand." He looked relieved, and that cut deeper than the rejection. Like dodging my presence was a weight off his chest. "I'll call you," he added, as if that was a kindness. I stepped back down the porch steps, 1 foot at a time. The photo box dug into my ribs where it hung awkwardly against my side. A cheap plastic tote, filled with 50 years of birthday cards, baby pictures, and love notes that now felt like museum artifacts no one cared to display. My suitcase wheels caught in the cracks of the sidewalk. I didn't bother to lift them. I didn't know where I was walking. I just knew I couldn't stand still. The houses on the street glowed warm behind their curtains. Windows framed silhouettes. Families watching TV, someone slicing vegetables, a child being twirled by her father. None of them mine. Not tonight. My mind darted backward, against my will. To scrape knees, to math homework, to every night I stayed late at the diner just to buy James those shoes he wanted so badly in 7th grade. His eyes had lit up like Christmas. He never knew I skipped dinner for a week. Now he couldn't spare a room. I turned onto a side street, the kind with old brick buildings and flickering yellow streetlights that made the shadows stretch too long. My hands were numb. Not from cold but from the grip I'd kept too tight on my own sense of pride. "Pride didn't keep you warm." "Ma'am," a voice called. I stopped. A woman stood in the doorway of a narrow brick building, a cardigan wrapped tight around her shoulders. She was maybe in her 30s, her accent soft but shaped by somewhere far warmer than this rain. Her eyes were full of something I hadn't seen all evening. Concern. "Are you all right?" I looked at myself then. My frizzy hair stuck to my forehead, my wet coat, the hopeless grip on that box. "Not really," I said. And then inexplicably I laughed. A hollow, bitter little laugh that made me feel foolish and alive at the same time. She came down the steps slowly, like I was a deer she didn't want to startle. "I'm Mina," she said. "Do you need somewhere dry to sit?" Her voice was warm, patient. I nodded before I could talk myself out of it. Inside, the apartment smelled of turmeric and soap. The living room was tiny but tidy, with a flickering lamp and 2 mugs already on the table. One half drunk, one still steaming. She moved my bags aside and wrapped a towel around my shoulders like I was a child. "You can sit as long as you like," she said. "No pressure." "I don't mean to impose." "You're not," she said gently. "Not even a little." The silence between us stretched comfortably. I looked around. A shelf of books in 3 languages. A quilt hung like art on the wall. The kettle hissed. "I used to have a place like this," I said quietly. Before things got small." Mina didn't ask what that meant. Instead, she poured me a cup of chai and slid it across the table. "Families," she said after a moment. "They surprise us. Not always in good ways." I didn't answer. My fingers curled around the warm ceramic. A thread of steam drifted upward. For a moment, I just breathed. I thought about my mother's funeral. About how James hadn't wanted to attend. Said it was too far, too inconvenient. I remembered whispering she was your grandmother. And him shrugging like it meant nothing. Maybe it did, to him. Mina sat across from me and opened a book, not to read but to give me space. It was a kind of kindness I hadn't seen in years. I stared at the tea until it went cold. I didn't drink it. I just held it. The warmth felt like the last soft thing in the world. The rain had stopped when I finally looked up. The city outside was still, like it was holding its breath. I realized I'd stopped shivering. "Thank you," I said, voice catching. Mina smiled without looking up. "Anytime." I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. I didn't know if James would call. I didn't know if I even wanted him to. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't completely invisible. Maybe kindness didn't die with my generation after all. The room had no history. No framed photos. No scuff marks where furniture used to be. No grooves worn into the carpet by restless pacing. Just a narrow bed, a modest dresser, and one square window that opened to the back alley and the rust-colored bricks of another building. It smelled faintly of lemon and cardamom. Clean, untouched. Temporary. I sat up slowly, my back protesting. A blanket had been pulled over me sometime during the night. I hadn't noticed Mina doing it. The early light filtered in, gray and gentle, as if it too was unsure of its place. My suitcase stood in the corner where I'd left it. The plastic photo box was beside it, still sealed shut with brittle tape. I hadn't opened it yet. Somehow, it felt too intimate for this quiet, borrowed space. My eyes landed on a small spiral notebook on the nightstand. Lined pages, cover bent at the corner. I didn't remember packing it. I ran my fingers over the cover, as if it might hum with something ancient. Picking it up felt heavier than it should have. I opened to a blank page and stared. At first, I didn't know what to write. But the words came anyway. The first time Claire forgot to tell me about a school play, I thought it was an honest mistake. Lila had only just started kindergarten. Maybe things got lost in the shuffle. It wasn't until the third missed performance that I stopped pretending I'd forgotten on purpose. I paused. The pen felt familiar in my hand, like an old friend who'd fallen silent for too long. James never said I wasn't welcome. He didn't have to. Claire did the talking in their house. Her tone was always so kind, too kind, like she was correcting a child who didn't know better. "Oh, Evelyn, that was last weekend. Or I thought you knew we changed the time." And I'd smile and nod, even when I knew she hadn't meant for me to be there at all. I stopped again. My chest ached, but not from grief exactly. It was the dull, persistent ache of erasure, of being quietly pushed out of a life I helped build. I flipped the page and kept writing. There were good moments. I can't lie to myself about that. Once, Lila asked me to read her favorite storybook while Claire was out. She curled up beside me like it was the most natural thing in the world. I remember thinking maybe it's not so bad. Maybe Claire just needs time. But time only grew the distance. A knock at the door broke my rhythm. "Evelyn." Mina's voice came through soft. "I made breakfast. If you're hungry." I set the notebook down and stood, the stiffness in my knees reminding me of all the birthdays and holidays spent on the periphery. I opened the door to the faint aroma of toasted cumin and something floral, jasmine maybe. In the kitchen, Mina had arranged 2 plates neatly. Scrambled eggs tinged yellow with turmeric, warm flatbread folded in a basket, and a steaming pot of tea sat between us. "I didn't know what you like," she said. "This is perfect," I murmured, surprised to find I meant it. We ate quietly. Mina glanced occasionally at her phone but never once made me feel like I was intruding. I appreciated that. She didn't ask questions about the night before, didn't prod for explanations. She simply offered food and presence. "Do you need anything today?" she asked as she rinsed her plate. I shook my head. "No, thank you. I think I'll just take a walk later. Get some air." Mina nodded and disappeared into the back room. When she returned, she held out a folded shawl, blue, with tiny embroidered flowers near the edge. "Here," she said. "It's warmer than it looks out there." I hesitated. "Are you sure?" She smiled. "Yes. It was my mother's." The fabric was soft in my hands, worn at the edges, and it carried the faint scent of sandalwood and something older, something like memory. I wrapped it around my shoulders with a care I hadn't felt in years. Like it was more than fabric. Like it was proof that some women still pass things down with meaning. As I stepped outside, the city hummed around me. Faint traffic, a busker strumming a guitar near the corner, a couple arguing gently over groceries. I walked slowly, each step deliberate, not because I was tired, but because I wasn't in a rush to be anywhere. I passed a bakery with fogged-up windows and a bookstore that hadn't opened yet. My hands stayed tucked in the shawl, fingers curled into the stitching like a child clinging to a hem. For a moment, I imagined what it might be like to start fresh. No family expectations, no walking on eggshells. Just a quiet life in a quiet room. The idea scared me. It also thrilled me. I thought again about that notebook waiting in the room. I hadn't written anything in years, not even Christmas cards. Words had always felt risky. They made things too real. But now, I felt an urge to record it all. Not just the big betrayals, but the subtle ones. The shifting tones. The invitations that never came. The way Lila's eyes used to light up when I'd sing an old song from her father's childhood. The way Claire started correcting me in front of her. Little snips, small cuts, all adding up. Was I being petty? Maybe. But I had swallowed enough over the years that bitterness wasn't something I feared anymore. What I feared was disappearing. Quietly. Like wallpaper fading under sunlight. I turned the corner near the park, where leaves were already beginning to yellow. On the bulletin board by the bus stop, a bright flyer caught my eye, bold letters in cheerful blue. Tell your story. Community night at the library, this Saturday at 6 p.m. All ages welcome. My gaze lingered on the word story. Something about it lodged in my chest. I wasn't ready. Not yet. But I folded the corner of the flyer between my fingers and slipped it into my coat pocket anyway. I stood there for a long time, watching the city pass me by. Young people rushing, a woman pushing a stroller, a man humming to himself with headphones on. No one knew me. And for once, that felt like power instead of pain. By the time I returned to Mina's apartment, the sun had shifted. Light poured through the kitchen window, catching the steam from a freshly brewed pot of tea. She was reading on the couch, a blanket over her legs, one hand cradling a chipped mug. She looked up. Nice walk. I nodded and held up the flyer. Found something interesting. Mina smiled, the kind of smile that didn't ask questions but said, I see you. I sat across from her, wrapped in her mother's shawl, and exhaled. I sat near the back of the room, clutching the folded flyer like a ticket to someplace unfamiliar. The library's community room was warmer than I expected. Its yellow light soft against the pale walls lined with books and thumbtacked posters. A folding table held a tray of ginger snaps and a percolator that sputtered with more effort than result. About a dozen chairs formed a loose circle. People trickled in, some in pairs, others alone like me. No one seemed to mind my silence. An older man with a salt and pepper ponytail opened the circle. We're not here to impress, he said. Just to speak or listen. Both are allowed. Nothing leaves this room unless you want it to. I nodded, though no one had asked. The first voice belonged to a younger man, probably mid-30s, who spoke about moving across 3 countries before the age of 10. His words were careful, accented with something musical. He described the taste of his grandmother's pickled mangoes in Syria, how it stayed on his tongue years after she passed. Everyone listened. Not politely, but with the kind of stillness you offer sacred things. Next came a woman in her 80s, Lena, I think, who told a story about planting cherry trees with her wife before the diagnosis came. We knew they wouldn't bloom in time, she said, her smile wry and lined with memory. But planting them still mattered. I didn't know why it surprised me. How people shared so easily here. Like they were placing fragile artifacts on a table and trusting they wouldn't be broken. The Armenian woman, dressed in layers of navy wool and rings that clinked when she gestured, spoke slowly. She told us about her daughter, the one she left behind when fleeing. Her voice didn't waver, but her eyes flicked toward the ceiling when she described the train station. The crying, the stillness after goodbye. Someone beside me inhaled sharply, then let it go. I felt the weight of that story settle in the folds of my coat. When the group leader glanced toward me, eyebrows raised gently, I nearly shook my head. But something in the room, maybe the silence, maybe the ginger in the air, held me still. I shifted forward in my chair, heart fluttering. My name is Evelyn, I said, and my voice sounded too loud at first. I wasn't planning to speak, so forgive me if I ramble. No one interrupted. That was invitation enough. I was 17 when I met my husband. I was late getting to the train station. My younger sister had taken my hairbrush, and I wouldn't leave until I found it. Silly now, but back then, I thought messy hair was a sin. A few people chuckled softly. He was leaning against a vending machine, jacket half unzipped, reading a comic book upside down. I asked if he knew where the platform was, and he looked at me like I'd offered him a second chance at something he didn't know he'd lost. I paused, a lump forming in my throat. We got married 6 years later. We fought a lot. We loved each other more. He passed away 12 years ago. Heart failure. Quiet. At home. Silence held us for a moment. The kind that didn't demand more, but waited in case you had it to give. I remember thinking the day he died, I'll never get to tell anyone about that moment at the vending machine again. Not the way I used to tell it to him. And now I've told you. My voice cracked on the last word. I hated that. But no one looked away. That somehow made it worse, and better. I sat down before I could second-guess the tears building behind my eyes. The rest of the evening blurred. Stories floated in and out, some mundane, some miraculous. A retired nurse spoke about delivering a baby in a supermarket parking lot. A young woman recited a letter she never sent to her estranged father. There were nods, gentle laughs, sometimes just silence. Afterward, I stood by the tray of ginger snaps, not hungry, just grounded by the ritual of hovering. A teenage girl approached, freckles, ponytail, the smell of laundry detergent clinging to her hoodie. She wore a name tag that read, Maya, volunteer. I liked your story, she said, fidgeting with her sleeves. Thank you. I replied, unsure what else to say. Will you come again? I smiled without thinking. Maybe. She grinned, satisfied with that lie, and walked off. Outside, the night had folded into itself. The walk home was quiet, the air crisp, the sky barely lit by street lamps. The shawl Mina had lent me caught the wind like a sail, but I held it close. I didn't think of James. Not once. Instead, I thought of the vending machine, of my husband's crooked smile, of how he'd sneak powdered sugar into my tea and pretend he didn't. I thought of how many times I'd told that train station story to him over the years, always embellishing the timing, the brush, the weather. He never corrected me. That was love, in its own way, letting someone rewrite the same moment 100 times and still finding it worth hearing. That night, I dreamt of trains. Not moving forward, but in reverse. Carriages gliding backward through time, stations collapsing into themselves, faces becoming younger, shoulders straighter, hair regaining its color. My husband sat beside me, humming off key. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. When I woke, the shawl was still wrapped around my shoulders, and the scent of tea leaves and rising dough drifted from the kitchen. The envelope sat askew on the small table by the door, tucked under Mina's keys. My name was written in blocky, uneven letters I knew by heart. Evelyn. All caps, no return address. Just that familiar loop in the Y that Lila had insisted on using ever since she learned cursive in 3rd grade. I hadn't seen her handwriting in nearly a year. My hand hovered over it for a long time before I picked it up, the paper warm from the morning sun. I turned it over slowly, like it might vanish if I moved too quickly. The seal cracked as I opened it, and a small, folded sheet of lilac stationery slid out, decorated in the corner with tiny sketched stars. A drawing fell with it, fluttering to the floor like a leaf. I recognized it instantly. The chalk pastel Lila had made when she was maybe 9. A crooked sunflower, smiling in the wrong direction. I had once framed it and put it in my kitchen. Claire told me it clashed with the backsplash. I took it down. Later, it disappeared. I picked up the drawing gently. There was a thumb smudge on the corner, mine probably. Or hers. The letter began without a greeting. I don't know how to start this, so I'm starting here. I saw you leave that night. I wasn't supposed to be near the door, but I was listening. I heard Dad say. I heard what he said. I didn't know what to do. I'm sorry I didn't say anything. I didn't come after you. I just stood there. My hands trembled slightly. I sat at Mina's small dining table, the scent of warm rice still lingering in the room from breakfast. I read slowly, afraid I'd miss something. It's hard. Mom and Dad don't talk about you. Not really. They just skip over you. Like you're an old photo that doesn't match the frame anymore. But I remember things. You always made me cinnamon toast even when you said it gave you heartburn. You sang off-key on purpose just to make me laugh. You came to all my dance recitals, even when you had to sit in the back row. I still have the scarf you gave me, the blue one with the little flowers. It smells like your closet. I paused, covering my mouth with one hand. That scarf had been a last-minute birthday gift. Claire had rolled her eyes at it. The letter continued. I don't know if I'm doing this right. I just wanted to say, I didn't forget you. I miss you. I don't know how to fix anything, but I wanted you to know that. It ended without a signature, just a small ink sketch of two hands almost touching, fingertips barely aligned. I read the letter again, slower this time, catching things I'd missed, the hesitations between lines, the ache tucked inside the ink. There was no anger in it. No excuses. Just a young girl trying to make sense of grown-up silences. I reached for my notebook and began to write. Not for the first time since I'd left James's house, but differently now. This time, I wrote with her in mind. Dear Lila, you don't need to know how to fix anything. That's not your job. Being a child, being a young woman, doesn't come with the burden of smoothing everyone else's sharp edges. I'm sorry you had to carry confusion that wasn't yours. I'm sorry you were made to choose with silence. I stopped to breathe. The words were there, but fragile. You were always kind to me. That counts for more than you know. I remember the scarf. I remember how you danced with your eyes closed because you said it helped you forget the audience. I remember how you used to hum when you were nervous. I miss you too. But more than that, I hope you're okay. I love you enough to let go, if that's what you need. But I'll be right here if you ever decide to reach back. I didn't ask her to visit. I didn't mention James or Claire. I didn't lay a trail of guilt for her to follow. I'd spent enough of my life shaping myself to be easy for others to hold. This time, I wanted to speak clearly. I folded the letter with care and slipped it into one of Mina's unused envelopes. It didn't quite fit, so I trimmed the edge with a pair of dull kitchen scissors. Mina came in just as I was sealing it. That looks important, she said, tying her hair up into a loose bun. It is, I replied. Need a stamp? Yes, please. She brought over a small tin from the bookshelf and sat beside me while I wrote Lila's name on the front. I can post it after my shift, she offered. I smiled. Thank you. The day stretched long after that. I could have spent it reading or writing or watching the pigeons fight over breadcrumbs on the windowsill. But instead, I found a broom and began sweeping the porch. The corners were dusty with wind-blown grit, and a few dried leaves huddled near the door. I worked slowly, pausing to straighten a cracked flower pot, tug weeds from between the brick steps. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I just wanted to be useful. The rhythm of it soothed me. The brush of bristles on concrete. The way effort passed time without requiring permission. When I finished, I sat on the stoop, warm from the late afternoon sun. I thought about how little I needed, really. A room. A quiet corner. A letter, folded with care. The porch smelled faintly of soap and dust. Somewhere down the street, someone was practicing piano. Hesitant chords drifting on the breeze. I closed my eyes and imagined Lila reading my letter. Maybe she'd cry. Maybe she wouldn't understand. Maybe she'd tuck it in a drawer and forget it. But maybe, just maybe, she'd feel less alone. That was enough for now. The door creaked behind me. Mina stepped out holding a basket of laundry, her sleeves pushed up. I forgot to ask, she said, balancing the basket on her hip. Are you free tonight? I suppose I am, I said, shading my eyes with one hand. My friend is hosting a small dinner. Just a few people. Nothing fancy. You'd be very welcome. I hesitated. The idea of meeting strangers unsettled me slightly, but I caught the invitation in her tone, not just politeness, but something gentler. A thread of community, loosely knotted. I stood, brushing lint from my slacks. All right, I said. But only if I can bring a jar of jam. Mina grinned. Deal. The dinner was held in a small third-floor apartment above a bookstore, the kind of place you could miss if you weren't looking for it. The hallway smelled of cumin and old paint, and the stairs creaked like they were remembering all the feet that had passed before mine. I clutched a jar of strawberry jam with a cloth bow tied around its lid. My contribution, more symbolic than practical. Mina rang the buzzer twice, and the door opened before the second tone faded. A woman in her 60s, curly gray hair, bright earrings, and the air of someone who'd hosted thousands of times, greeted us. "You must be Evelyn," she said, pulling me into a warm hug before I could answer. "We've heard things. Only good, I hope." She winked. "Only the best kind of trouble." The apartment was small but alive. Plants in corners, books stacked on radiators, paintings that looked handmade. The kitchen light flickered once, and then held steady, as if it had decided to behave for the guests. A mismatched set of chairs surrounded the table, which groaned slightly under bowls of lentils, rice, roasted vegetables, and a platter of something spicy and fragrant. Introductions were brief, names exchanged like gentle offerings. Mina floated in and out of the kitchen, barefoot and humming. I didn't speak much. I didn't need to. The room was already full of stories. A young man named Adil spoke first. His voice was low, careful. "My father stopped speaking to me after I married my partner," he said, glancing at the man beside him, who reached over and squeezed his hand. There was a pause, but not the kind that begged to be filled. Just space, like the room had expanded to make room for the truth. "I used to think silence was worse than anger," Adil continued. "But now I think it's just a different shape of grief." No one interrupted. No one tried to explain or soothe. They just listened. Later, a woman named Ruth, her hair twisted into a loose bun, joked, "I'm the ghost of our family. They only remember me when they need someone to bring wine." The laughter that followed wasn't hollow. It was the kind that comes from a shared understanding of pain. One that doesn't need to be explained. I found myself smiling. Not at the joke, exactly, but at the comfort of being among people who knew that sorrow didn't always require fixing. Sometimes it just needed a place to sit. I passed the lentils to Mina without speaking. She offered me a piece of naan, warm and torn at the edge. As plates emptied and wine bottles uncorked, the stories deepened, small admissions, buried wounds brought to the surface without drama. A man spoke of his brother's addiction. Another woman confessed that she hadn't spoken to her mother in 7 years, not out of hatred, but because I got tired of translating my own pain. That one hit somewhere in my ribs. I looked down at my hands, wrinkled and knotted, resting on my lap like they didn't know where they belonged. For years, I had accepted the crumbs of inclusion. Smiles that didn't reach eyes. Invitations issued out of duty. Every slight I had explained away. Claire's carefully chosen words, James's passive retreat. She didn't mean it like that. "He's just tired. It's not personal." How many times had I said that to myself? But what if it was personal? What if it had always been? Mina leaned over to refill my glass with water, her touch brief, grounding. "You okay?" she asked softly, her voice just for me. I nodded. "I think so." Her smile was sad and knowing. She didn't press. We left just past 10. The night was cool and quiet. The city softened under a gentle wind. We walked without urgency, our steps falling into an easy rhythm. I clutched my coat closed at the collar. "That was lovely," I said. Mina nodded. "They're good people. Flawed, messy, but good." We paused near a row of closed shops, the streetlights casting long shadows on the sidewalk. "I've been thinking," I said, watching my breath cloud in the air, "about how many times I let things slide. How often I swallowed what I should have said." Mina looked at me, her expression soft. "Sometimes families love us wrong," she said quietly. "Doesn't mean we're unlovable." The words landed gently, but they cracked something open. I nodded once, then again. My lips parted like I might speak, but nothing came. Just the sharp, stinging warmth of eyes filling too fast. I turned slightly, ashamed, but Mina didn't look away. We walked the rest of the way in silence, save for the quiet hum of the city around us. Back in the apartment, I placed the jam jar in the fridge and hung Mina's shawl on the chair. The room was still. I poured myself a small cup of tea from the kettle, now lukewarm, and carried it to the window. I didn't cry right away. It came in waves. Not the kind of sobs that tear from your chest, but something smaller, quieter. A slow unraveling. Years of pent-up questions, of smiling too wide, of forgiving what should have been named. I cried because no one had ever said that before, not like Mina had. Not with kindness, not without pity. Families could love you wrong, and you could still be worthy of love. I stood there until the tea turned cold, the cup still in my hands, untouched. I didn't bother to reheat it. The street outside was empty, but I didn't feel alone. Not anymore. The neighborhood hadn't changed, not in the few weeks I'd been gone, and certainly not in the years before that. Same hedges trimmed too neatly. Same blue recycling bins lined in rows like little soldiers. Same brittle quiet hanging in the air, like everyone inside the houses was holding their breath. James's house looked exactly as I remembered it. Beige siding, that cracked step no one ever fixed. The porch light that flickered even during daylight. It was strange how familiar it still felt, like a room in an old dream. But today, I stood on the sidewalk, not the porch. And I didn't knock. I had checked. They were at Lila's school for some parent volunteer event. Claire had posted a photo on her social media. Her and James smiling beside a lemonade stand, faces stretched into happiness. I walked up the driveway slowly, feet crunching on the gravel they still hadn't replaced. And there it was, tucked beneath a dusty plastic tarp. My photo box. Right where I had left it, weeks ago. No one had moved it. No one had thrown it out. But no one had brought it inside either. I picked it up. The lid creaked, tape curled at the edges. A dead leaf clung to the corner. I wiped it off. Across the street, the neighbor, Mrs. Willoughby, stood watering her geraniums. "Evelyn," she called, squinting. I waved. Margaret." "I wondered what happened to you," she said, setting the watering can down. "Saw your box on the porch, figured you'd come back." "I wasn't sure I would," I replied honestly. She stepped closer, wiping her hands on her apron. "You want me to hold on to it till you're done walking around? It looks heavy." I hesitated, then nodded. "That would be kind. I'll come by for it in an hour." She took the box without another word, and I watched her carry it inside like it was something fragile, sacred. I didn't walk long. Just a loop around the block, long enough to calm the tightness in my chest. When I returned, she had placed the box gently on a wooden bench beside her front door. "Thank you," I said. "You're welcome, dear." Her eyes lingered on mine. Some things are worth saving. I carried the box home in both arms, like an offering. Back in Mina's apartment, I laid a towel on the floor and set the box down, not ready to open it on a table meant for meals. I took the lid off slowly. The first thing I saw was a birthday card. One of the handmade ones James used to give me when he was a child. Lopsided hearts, crayons, the words "I love you, Mommy" in crooked lines. My throat tightened. I pulled out the albums one by one. Thick leather-bound books, soft with wear. Pages sticking slightly from years of being stored, handled, forgotten. I flipped to a photo of James's 6th birthday. Him grinning, frosting on his nose, a homemade chocolate cake in front of him. I had burned the first one that year, and stayed up till midnight baking a second. He never knew. He just said it was the best cake he'd ever had. There was a picture of my husband shaving in the kitchen sink, steam curling in the air, half a smile on his face as he caught me snapping the photo. He always said the bathroom mirror made him look older. I never understood that until I caught my own reflection years later. Another page. James asleep on my chest, barely 3, his thumb in his mouth and his small body tucked into mine like a question mark. I remember how I had sat like that for hours, afraid to move, afraid to lose the weight of him. They never asked me about these moments. Not James. Not Claire. Not even Lila. But they were mine. All mine. Each photo was a sentence in a language I had spoken fluently, but never been asked to teach. The quiet lunches, the scraped knees cleaned with trembling fingers, the lullabies hummed in low light, the times I chose their peace over my presence. For so long, I thought maybe these memories didn't matter if no one asked to hear them. But holding these images now, I felt something shift. They mattered because I remembered them. Because I had lived them. Because they were proof. I sat on the floor for hours, pulling out photo after photo, narrating softly to the stillness around me. This was the day he rode a bike without training wheels. This is when he lost his first tooth. And I told him the tooth fairy was real, even though I couldn't afford $1. This was the day we said goodbye to his father at the hospital. There was no audience, just me, but the act of telling, of saying it aloud, was its own kind of witness. Later that evening, when the light began to slant through the curtains in long golden stripes, I opened my notebook again. This time, I didn't write journal entries. I started something different. A book. Not for sale. Not for strangers. A book of letters and lessons and moments Lila had never been told. Not because I wanted to rewrite the past, but because I wanted her to inherit more than silence. I began with a single photo, her in a paper crown, age 5, missing a front tooth and holding a spoon like a microphone. Dear Lila, you always loved to perform. You once sang Twinkle Twinkle Little Star so loudly at the grocery store that a man in line started clapping. I remember thinking you had a universe inside you, burning so brightly you didn't even know it. There's so much I want you to know, not just about me, but about you. About where you come from. Not the bloodline or the name, but the small things. How you tap your pencil when you're thinking. How you used to twirl in circles when you were nervous. How you once told me that the moon looked lonely and asked if I could bake it a friend. I didn't try to be poetic. I didn't try to be wise. I just told the truth. Somewhere in the middle of the second page, I realized something. I wasn't writing to preserve the past. I was writing to give her something living. Something she could return to when the world got loud and uncertain. A legacy, yes. But not the kind carved in marble. The kind made of paper and ink and breath. By the time Mina came home, the floor around me was littered with photographs and torn scraps of notebook paper. She paused in the doorway, surveying the mess with a raised brow. Did a memory tornado pass through here? She teased. Something like that, I said, smiling. She didn't ask questions. Just stepped around the scattered memories and placed a warm hand on my shoulder. Want tea? She asked. Please. The library smelled like paper and polish, a comforting blend of age and attention. I arrived early, carrying my notebook tucked beneath my arm and a manila envelope filled with a few carefully chosen photographs. I hadn't planned to share them, not really. But something about holding them felt like bringing ancestors into the room. The storytelling circle had grown since my first visit. A few familiar faces greeted me with soft nods and quiet smiles. The chairs were set in a slightly wider circle tonight, as if making space for more than just bodies. Memories, too. I sat, unfolding the flap of my envelope just enough to peek at the first photo inside. My husband, 30 years old, in his Navy uniform, squinting against the sun. His smile was barely there but unmistakable to me. I'd like to read something, I said when the facilitator opened the floor. A few heads turned gently in my direction. I cleared my throat and opened my notebook. This is a letter to my granddaughter, I began. But maybe it's also a letter to the girl I used to be, who didn't know how much she would miss the things no one else remembered. I read aloud a passage about my husband teaching James how to fish with string and safety pins, about burnt pancakes on Sunday mornings and slow dances in the living room while Lila toddled between our feet. The group listened. No one interrupted. I wasn't reading for applause. I was reading to bring something forgotten back to life. Afterward, as people rose to refill their tea or stretch their legs, an older man across the circle leaned forward slightly. Did you say your husband's name was Thomas Albridge? He asked, his voice gravelly but measured. I blinked. Yes, you knew him? I think so, he said, rising with effort. He wore a brown cardigan with suede elbow patches and held a cane in one hand. I'm George. George Mendel. We were in the Navy together. Pacific Fleet. 67 to 69. I stared at him, stunned. He talked about you, George added. Not often. But when he did, it was with that look people get when they're trying not to fall apart in front of other men. I smiled despite the lump forming in my throat. He always said no one wanted to hear about home. George chuckled. We all wanted to. We just didn't know how to ask. He motioned toward a quiet table in the corner, and I followed him there. We sat across from each other, two weathered bookends with stories wedged between us. He was loyal, George said, his eyes scanning some unseen memory in the distance. And funny. God, he had this way of telling jokes that made you laugh even before the punchline. That sounds right, I whispered. But he was overwhelmed sometimes. Quiet. Especially when he read the letters. I leaned in. What letters? From you, I assume. He always opened them at night, after lights out. Said they smelled like the laundry room back home. I covered my mouth, trying not to cry. He carried a picture, George said. Of you and your boy. Said it was his anchor. He kept it in the inside pocket of his coat. Near the heart, he'd joke. Claimed that's what made it beat. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. George paused, then reached into his wallet and pulled out a worn photograph, black and white, edges frayed. This is from a day off in Okinawa. He took this of me while I was trying to look cool in sunglasses. He handed it over. I studied it. Young men, dirt on their boots, stories in their posture. My husband wasn't in the frame, but I could feel him in the way George held it. The moment was alive in his memory, and now somehow mine too. Thank you, I said. He nodded, folding the photo and slipping it back into his wallet. It's strange, he said, his voice gentler now. How we carry each other forward without realizing it. I stared down at my own photos, spreading them slowly across the table. He never told James, I said. About the picture. Or the letters. Or any of it. Maybe he didn't know how, George replied. Some things are easier to keep close than to explain. We sat in companionable silence for a while after that, the noise of the others fading into the background. Before we parted, George touched my hand lightly. You should tell your granddaughter, he said. About all of it. Let her carry some of it forward, too. I'm trying, I said. In pages. That night, I returned to Mina's with a quiet ache in my chest. Not grief exactly, but something adjacent to it. A tenderness for the man I loved, and for the version of myself who never knew just how much space she held in his heart. I opened my notebook and began a new page in the legacy book. There are people who leave, and there are people who stay in unexpected ways. Sometimes they show up years later in the hands of strangers, in old stories, in the way someone remembers how he held a photo like it was made of gold. We are more than who remembers us. We are who we choose to remember. I was sitting in the library, third table from the window, my notebook open to a half-written sentence when the door creaked. It wasn't loud, but something about the rhythm of it made me look up. And there she was, Lila. Her hair was longer now, dyed the color of old copper pennies, pulled back into a loose braid. She wore a navy hoodie too big for her frame, and held a spiral-bound journal close to her chest like a shield. She looked taller, older, but also, strangely, smaller. Like life had given her weight and taken something else in return. She saw me immediately. No hesitaste. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Hi, I said softly. Hi, she echoed. She stood there a beat too long, then walked over and sat in the chair across from me. The same chair George had filled just a few days ago. Her hands rested on the journal, fingers twitching like they wanted to open it, but didn't know how. I wasn't sure you'd be here, she said. I wasn't sure you'd come, I replied. A small, crooked smile flickered on her face and then disappeared. Silence settled between us. Not the heavy kind this time, but something lighter. A silence made of waiting, not avoidance. I almost turned around, she admitted. Twice. I'm glad you didn't. She nodded, then traced a circle on the wooden table with her thumb. I got your letter, she said. I've read it about a dozen times. I hoped you would. It made me cry. Her voice cracked slightly, but not in a bad way. I let that hang in the air. I wanted to write back, she added quickly, but I didn't know what to say, so I just started drawing instead. She turned her journal toward me and flipped to a page. A sketch, ink pencil, maybe charcoal, of two hands barely touching across a blank page. The same image she'd drawn at the bottom of her letter, but now fuller, more textured. I ran my finger gently near the edge. "It's beautiful," I said. "I wasn't trying to be," she whispered. "I just missed you." I exhaled slowly, my hands folded in my lap, so I wouldn't reach for her too fast. "I missed you too, sweetheart." She closed the book and hugged it to her chest again. "Things at home are weird. They talk about you like you moved away on your own. Like it was all decided and settled. But I remember what happened. And I don't know how to unremember it." "You don't have to," I said gently. She blinked fast and looked away. "I'm thinking of leaving," she said, almost to the window instead of me. "Going to a school upstate. It's an art program. Nothing fancy. But it's mine." I didn't say anything. "I don't want to lose you again," she said, finally looking me full in the eyes. "And I don't want to choose between you and them." "You don't have to choose," I said. "You never did. But they make it feel like I do." I reached for my tea and took a small sip to steady myself. "I can't change how they see the world," I said slowly. "But I can promise you this. I'll be right here no matter what. When you're ready. In your own time." Her jaw tightened, but she nodded. The braid on her shoulder slid forward, and she tucked it back behind her ear with trembling fingers. "I want to know you better," she said. "Not just the version I got in glimpses. There's a lot to tell." "I figured," she smiled faintly. I opened my bag and pulled out the legacy book, unfinished, worn at the edges, pages still loose and scrawled in my crooked handwriting. I hesitated for a moment, then slid it across the table toward her. "It's not done," I said. "But maybe it doesn't have to be." She looked down at the cover, fingertips brushing the corner. "Can I read it?" "I want you to." She opened the first page. Her lips moved as she read the lines silently to herself. Her eyes began to shine, and I looked away to give her space. When she finally closed the book, she placed both hands on top of it and let out a breath. "Can I add to it someday? Whenever you're ready." A beat passed. "I have to go soon," she said reluctantly. "Mom thinks I'm at the library for tutoring." I almost laughed, but it caught in my throat. "Tell her whatever you need to," I said. She stood slowly, the journal still pressed against her chest, my legacy book tucked gently into her tote bag. "I don't know what happens next," she said at the doorway. "You don't have to," I replied. "Your story is your own. I'll be here when you're ready to tell it." She looked back one last time, lips trembling. "I love you, Grandma." It was the first time she'd said it in years. "I love you too, baby," I whispered. And then she was gone. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. The idea came like a flicker, quick and quiet, as I stood in front of the library bulletin board. A modest flyer flapped in the breeze from the heater vent. "Local voices. Share your story exhibit. Submissions open." I didn't move for a while. Just stood there with my scarf bunched at my neck, heart ticking softly, remembering Lila's voice, remembering George's hands on that weathered photo, remembering the taste of silence after truth was spoken. Later that night, I brought the idea to Mina. She was steeping tea in her favorite chipped mug. "I want to create something," I told her, "for people like us. People with stories no one ever asked about." She didn't blink. Didn't ask what I meant by like us. She simply said, "I'll help." It began with sketches on napkins and lists scribbled on the back of old envelopes. We talked to the library staff who were surprisingly enthusiastic. They offered the side gallery, 2 long walls of unused corkboard, and an old display table with a broken corner. I spent my afternoons gathering voices. I visited the senior center, the food co-op, the quiet woman who lived 2 floors down with her cat and classical music. I asked for anything they wanted to share. A memory, a moment, a regret. I told them it didn't need to be pretty. Most of them hesitated. But then they came back, with yellowed letters, photos tucked behind receipts, napkins with smudged handwriting, journal pages torn from the middle of a story. One man handed me a black and white picture of a picnic in 1962. On the back he had written, "This was the day I knew I loved him." He never knew. A woman brought in a note from her daughter, written when she was 10, saying, "You're the best mommy because you let me sleep in your bed when I'm scared." The woman told me her daughter hadn't spoken to her in 6 years. Each story came with weight, but also light. And each one, no matter how small, was worthy. Lila mailed in a drawing of an empty bench beneath a flowering tree. Below it she had written, "Some things bloom late, but they still bloom." I cried when I opened it. Mina and I spent evenings arranging everything, mounting pages to boards with care, layering textures of memory like a quilt. The name came to me one night while I was brushing my hair. The stories they forgot to ask. When opening night arrived, I wore my softest sweater and the scarf Lila had once borrowed and never returned, until now. The gallery wasn't full, but the people who came didn't just wander. They read. Slowly. Thoughtfully. They leaned in close to examine handwriting, smiled at the black and white photos, nodded at lines underlined in trembling pens. One woman stood crying in front of a poem about a brother lost to addiction. A man stared for 15 minutes at a child's drawing of a house with a cracked window and a dog in the yard. No one tried to explain it. No one needed to. At the center of the room was a table stacked with paper and pens, and a sign that read, "Add your story. Someone is listening." People did. Near the end of the night, the librarian nodded at me. "Do you want to say a few words?" I stepped up, palms sweaty, voice unsure. I looked at the faces, tired, tender, curious. I thought about rehearsing, but I didn't. Instead, I told the truth. "I used to think growing old meant becoming invisible," I said. "That people stopped seeing you, stopped asking. But maybe it's not about fading. Maybe it's about layering, adding things. More truth, more memory, more voice." I paused. We all carry stories no one asks about. But we're still here. And we still matter. The applause was gentle. Nothing dramatic. But a few people wiped tears. Afterward, some left quickly. But a small group stayed. They came quietly, like moths to lamplight. One woman whispered, "I haven't seen my son in 10 years. Another said, "My sister stopped inviting me to holidays after I told her who I loved." A third simply said, "Thank you." We stood together, nothing to fix, just witnessing each other's truths. In that moment, I realized something I hadn't known how to name before. Dignity isn't something you're given. It's something you hold on to. Especially when everything else has fallen away. It's in the choice to tell your story. To claim your place. To be seen, even if no one ever asked. I left the library with cold fingers and a full heart. And tomorrow, I would be 75. 75. The number didn't sit heavy on my chest like I once feared it would. It rested gently, like a shawl pulled snug around my shoulders on a brisk morning. Earned, not endured. The morning sun filtered through the window with that golden softness I'd come to love. The scent of cinnamon and clove drifted from the kitchen, where Mina was humming and clinking dishes. I stayed in bed a few extra minutes, letting the light and quiet wrap around me like a private celebration. There were no balloons. No streames. No calls from James and none expected. But I didn't feel empty. Not anymore. By noon, the living room held a small circle of warmth. Mina had invited a few of our regulars from the storytelling group. Ruth with her bright earrings, George with his cane and slow smile. A quiet couple who always brought fig jam and kind eyes. We drank cardamom tea and shared warm slices of homemade bread. No one brought gifts, just stories. Small ones, full of laughter and memory, handed out like offerings. On the kitchen table sat a round cake, glazed in a thin layer of orange syrup, its scent sharp and sweet. One candle stood in the center, just one. That felt right. I didn't need to count years. I only needed to mark this moment. Before I could blow it out, Mina handed me a small envelope. "It came this morning," she said, "from Lila." I held it in my lap for a second longer than I meant to. Her handwriting was still the same, slightly slanted, as though it couldn't quite stay within the lines. I opened it slowly, careful not to tear the corner. Inside was a folded note on thick paper, and a pressed wildflower taped to the corner. I smiled. She used to collect them when she was little, convinced each one had a name only she could hear. The letter was short, but it pressed every part of me. Dear Grandma. I wanted to come. I did. But Mom said it would make things harder. I'm still figuring out how much space I'm allowed to take up. So I'm writing instead. I hope that's okay. I used to think silence was strength, that if I kept the peace and didn't speak, no one would get hurt. But you taught me something different. You taught me that speaking, really speaking, is what heals. That it's okay to be the one who remembers out loud. I'm proud of you. I hope someday you'll be proud of me too. Happy birthday. I love you. Lila. I read it twice, then folded it carefully and tucked it against my chest. Mina met my gaze, her eyes shining. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. We lit the candle, and they sang, not loudly, not perfectly, but sweetly like they meant it. I closed my eyes and made no wish. I had already been given what I needed. Later, when the guests had gone and the tea had gone cold, I returned to my room. The legacy book sat on my desk, its pages fanned open like it had been waiting. I added one more entry. Today I turned 75. I was not surrounded by family in the way I once imagined, but I was surrounded by witnesses, people who saw me, and allowed me to see them. There was cake. There was laughter. And there was a letter that reminded me silence is not where love lives, it's where it gets buried. This book began as a lifeline. Now it feels like a bridge. I closed the book gently, ran my hand across the worn cover, and placed it on the shelf beside my bed. Next to it, I slid in a new notebook. Blank. Waiting. Because I wasn't done. Not yet. I sat at the edge of the bed and watched the late sun stretch across the floorboards, lighting up the soft dust in the air like tiny fireflies. I thought about the years I spent dimming myself. The holidays where I smiled too wide. The dinners where I held my tongue. The years I waited for someone to ask the right question. And then I thought about the last few weeks. The library. George. Lila. Mina. The exhibit. The hands that reached back when I reached out first. No, I hadn't faded. I had layered. I had lived. And maybe, just maybe, the point was never whether they came back. Not James. Not Claire. Not even Lila in the way I once hoped. Maybe the point wasn't their return. Maybe the point was that I never truly left myself behind.